So, for some reason, Resident Evil, or rather Capcom, were going to do the most outlandish thing ever. Create a mainline Resident Evil game and make it a online-only game. Because if we know anything about Resident Evil and online games, is that almost every online Resident Evil game has been god-awful. So let's look at this article on VGC by Andy Robertson. Capcom reveals Resident Evil Requiem, which is the 9th Resident Evil game, started as an online game, and then quote, "But we realized fans didn't want it." That is very interesting. So I did a quick Google search, and with the help of Google's AI, which I, hazard to call correct, but it kind of adds to my point, I suppose. I basically Googled multiplayer only Resident Evil games, and then basically we found out that those games were Resident Evil Outbreak, Resident Evil Resistance, Resident Evil Reverse, and Umbrella Corp. Now, all 4 of these games have one very huge thing in common besides being multiplayer only Resident Evil games. They all suck. They're all very, very bad games. As someone who has recently 100%ed Reverse due to how awful the game is, and I still need to jump into Resident Evil Resistance, mind you, while the online is still alive. And same thing for Umbrella Corps, because I know I've got both of these games in my library somewhere. I think it's, without a shadow of a doubt, pretty easy to say that online Resident Evil games suck and are awful. So for a mainline game to take that risk, and probably it wouldn't even have done well, to be completely honest, because keeping in mind that the weakest mainline Resident Evil games are, depending on who you ask, either 2 and 3, or rather 3, or 5 and 6, which if you ask me, I'd say 3 was actually better than 5 and 6. Yes, 3 is a shorter game that's more action oriented to the horror of what 0, 1, and 2 are. 3 is the weakest, obviously, of the first 4 games in the series, but it doesn't change the fact that 5 and 6 went so beyond anything that I feel like... No, 6. I think 6 is easily the worst. While 5 can be considered one of the worst games in the series, 6 just jumped the gun way too bloody hard in the Resident Evil verse, to the point where they had to reboot the whole thing, and Resident Evil 7 was an absolute bloody banger. But during that period of time, before we got Resident Evil 7, we did get stuff like, and I'm going to go back to the multiplayer only games, we did in fact get Umbrella Corp, which was just awful in and of itself. But yeah, so Capcom revealed that it was testing an open world and online concepts for Resident Evil Requiem before settling on a traditional single-player game, which should just have been the thought from the very beginning. Speaking in an extended developer diary video available to members of Capcom's website, Requiem director Koshi Nakanishi shared a brief look at the early online version of Resident Evil 9 and said it was ultimately abandoned because he realized it wasn't what fans wanted. Yes, fans want single-player games when it comes to horror games, because multiplayer doesn't do particularly well, since you can't really immerse yourself when someone else is attached to that very experience that you are experiencing. That being said, so this is from his words, quote, "You might have heard some of the rumors, things like an online Resident Evil or an open world Resident Evil, which we spent some time experimenting with," he said. But in the, end quote, or rather continuing, "But in the end, although we had some interesting concepts, we realized that it wasn't what fans wanted to see or play. So we went back to the drawing board and created what led to Resident Evil Requiem." And that's good to know, because the first word of RE9's origins came to light from prolific series insider Dusk Golem, which has been an insider for quite some time, I feel like, at this point, who wrote on social media last month that the game started development in 2017 and starred series protagonists Leon and Joe. And of course, according to Golem, the original version of RE9 was trying to be the opposite of first-person entry RE7, but the project got a pretty heavy reboot in 2021 around the time Village came out. And keeping in mind that the director of Village said that he wanted the game to not be as scary as Resident Evil 7, which is kind of the opposite of what Resident Evil fans wanted, and that's why 8 was nowhere near as scary as 7. when it really should have been. Granted, yes, you can refer to the dollhouse all you like in 8, but 7 was genuinely freaky from the get-go and remained freaky throughout most of the game until they added those sludge monsters halfway through, and you could basically just plant C4 in their direction and have them just kind of explode as is. Just saying. Yeah, of course, Capcom premiered their gameplay and is going to be releasing 27th February. Yep, of course, PS5, Xbox Series S and X, and PC. I hope that it doesn't get delayed. But yeah, also, the main character actually comes from I guess technically a side game. So basically, Grace, the main character of Resident Evil 9, or at least from what we know of it, is the daughter of Resident Evil Outbreak's Alyssa. And so basically Grace is part of the FBI. And another series inclusion is that basically the game is going to take place 30 years after Raccoon City was bombed in the events of Resident Evil 3. So basically this is a sequel in a way to Resident Evil 3 that takes place 30 years later. Requiem initially looked like a familiar successor to the first-person games of RE7 and Village, with Ashcroft trapped in some sort of gothic hospital, and for me personally, it did give me some vibes along the lines of Saw traps and stuff like that, so I thought they were going down that sort of path. But that, yeah, this whole phrase was written in a Resident Evil Requiem preview, but, you know, that's just kind of either here nor there. That being said, however, the game does actually look really cool. I am very much looking forward to it. I do hope that these sort of like, Saw trap like things that are going on are going to be part of the game. There's a lot that I could talk about from the Resident Evil ethos and history of the games, and talking about like, Resident Evil 3, Outbreak, and whatever have you. The main thing that I'm hoping for is that this game is going to be good. That's the one thing I want the most. Because Resident Evil has had a fairly trippy history, and I mean, the games have been around for a really long time. The series has been around for a long time, so no doubt we were going to get some bad games in there every now and again. But it seems but they have more good games than bad, so I really do hope they continue on with the strategy of actually making good Resident Evil games. But with all of that being said, however, I'm very excited, very happy, and looking forward to Resident Evil Requiem. Let me know what you guys think about Resident Evil as a franchise, but not just that. Are you guys actually looking forward to this game, and whether or not you're actually going to play and buy it? Because I'm certainly one of those people who is very excited. I'll probably wait for a sale first, but during that time, I can refresh myself on some of the earlier Resident Evil games, like Resident Evil 3, for example, given that that game actually had a remake not too long ago. So, with all that being said, however, let me know what you guys think about all of this in the comments below. Like the video if you liked it, subscribe to the channel. I'm aiming for 500 subs by the end of the year. And with all that being said, I do upload every day, so I'll see you guys tomorrow.